Hello and welcome to episode 182 of the Book Binge, a video that has been over a year since the time that it was originally planned to come out. Unfortunately, my reading of the last three books in the series also took way longer than anticipated, hence the delay. Here we are now, shortly after my reread's completion of The Heroes of Olympus by Riordan, the sequel to Percy Jackson and the Olympians. Percy Jackson and the Olympians is one of my favorite nostalgia reads as a series. In fact, I just reread it a couple of years ago. I have a channel from a video on the channel from a couple of years ago reviewing and ranking the books upon my reread of Percy Jackson back before. Shortly after which I decided to commence my reread of Heroes of Olympus. Well, shortly after which I say, but it was actually 2023 when I finally started with The Last Hero, because I did King Chronicles after Percy Jackson and before this one. So in May of 2020, well, April and May, somewhere in there, that April-May period of 2023, I read these two, The Lost Hero and Son of Neptune, rereading the first couple books in the series. Mark of Athena, I reread, I believe, in March of this year, somewhere around that time in 2024. I reread The House of Hades sometime between then and now, and The Blood of Olympus just in June. So, you know, over a few months in 2024, finally going back and finishing the series, which I'm very, very glad I did. I really, really enjoy Riordan. He's one of my favorite authors for more than just nostalgia reasons. I found that all three of these series has held up splendidly, quite frankly, and today I'm going to cover this series now. So if you haven't read Percy Jackson, well, you may not want to watch this video. I don't know how into spoilers I'm going to get. Definitely not going to talk very many spoilers about this series specifically. Maybe some very minor stuff that I don't think is going to ruin anything. But there's always the chance that something gets said from Percy Jackson that, you know, is spoiled because this series exists as a sequel to that series. So just keep that in mind if you're going to watch this video. Before we get into the actual review stuff, I do want to start with, you know, how I first came to this series. This was something that I explained a little bit in the Percy Jackson video, but I want to cover again here, just in case you're interested. My first Rick Riordan book, not counting the first book in the 39 Clues, I'm pretty sure was The Mark of Athena, which sounds pretty weird because this is the third book in the sequel series. Yes, it is true. This was actually the first one of these books that I read. I first saw The Mark of Athena when a friend of mine back in middle school got it more or less at the release time. I asked to borrow it. She, for absolutely no reason at all, and allowed me to borrow it. I realized I had no idea what was really happening. I got like 2/3 of the way through the book, and I was like, I don't really know what's going on. Obviously, because I missed an entire series and half of the series before this book's release. So I decided that I would actually go back and start from the beginning. After my original reading of this series, after, you know, reading Percy Jackson and then going through this became an all-time favorite. After this reread, I can say that absolutely holds up. And before I actually came to do booktube stuff, I would have said that my two favorite series at the time were The Underland Chronicles by Susan Collins and then The Heroes of Olympus by Rick Riordan, kind of tied in that #1 spot. Underland Chronicles I still really like. I have a full series review and ranking of that series as well on the channel. In fact, that video did surprisingly well. I thought that video would flop hard on this channel, and it actually didn't really flop, so thank you for the people who watched that. But even now, I would still say that series is some sort of a favorite. A lot of that is because of nostalgia, but also because I think it is genuinely good, even though it is a middle grade series, and I'm a little bit old for the series as it exists. I still think it's pretty high quality. Heroes of Olympus, I would say pretty similar things about, but this thing is a little bit more YA than it is middle grade, which is a point we'll talk to a little bit later in this video. But this whole series also holds up just the way that Riordan does for me. If you're not really a fan of this kind of stuff, if you read Percy Jackson and the Olympians and you think it's just okay, I would probably still encourage people to read this because I think it's better and more mature in a lot of ways. But it's also still pretty clearly Riordan's style. But I'm kind of tipping my hand here a little bit. And getting into some points that I should be making in the review section. So let's actually get into more of the review section, starting off, as I normally do with reviews, with the good of Heroes of Olympus. If you have read Percy Jackson and you wanted it to mature a tiny bit, speaking on that point specifically, this is the series for you. This is definitely that kind of style, but instead of more of a middle grade focus, it's more of a YA focus because of, you know, the audience growing up with these books would have been getting a little bit older in their teen years when these books were coming out, or into their preteens when these books were coming out, depending on when they read them. And so their reading level and their personal maturity was probably increasing a little bit, and thus these books had to grow along with them to some degree. That is what Riordan did with Heroes of Olympus, and I think he did so splendidly. If you wanted to see what Riordan could do with multiple POVs, this is also that, because this is the only one of these series in the Riordan verse, as we like to call the Percy Jackson universe, comprising, well, I mean, technically King Chronicles crosses in. This is why we call it the Riordan verse. You know, Percy Jackson and the Olympians, Heroes of Olympus, Kane Chronicles, Trials of Apollo, Magnus Chase and the Gods of Asgard, all of these series that Riordan has done, even the Percy Jackson and the Olympians sequel series, which has started to come out the last couple of years, which I do plan to read at some point. I'll probably do that after I've read Magnus Chase and then also Trials of Apollo. That's a side point that I didn't really need to make. Out of all 5 of these series, we'll say, Heroes of Olympus is the only one that is not first person with one POV. Well, actually, Kane Chronicles has 2 POVs, but they're still first person. So there's a little bit of that quality in there, having multiple POVs. But the other 3 series, Percy Jackson, Magnus Chase, and Trials of Apollo, as far as I know, are all singular POV. This series is multiple POVs, and not just 2 POVs like Kane Chronicles. It's always at least 3 POVs per book. In fact, it's 3 POVs for the first 2 books, and I believe it's like 4 POVs for the 4th or for the 3rd book, and then like 5 or 6 for the 5th book, and probably like 6 or 7 for the 4th book. So like there's multiple POVs and genuinely different POVs. This is that kind of thing, and I think it's great. We'll talk a little bit more on that in just a little bit. Basically, if you're someone looking to get into epic fantasy, or if you have kids who you want to get into epic fantasy, this series following after Percy Jackson, if you get them into reading with Percy Jackson and then continue on with this is something that's a little bit likely to kind of get them into that sort of epic fantasy sphere, because it's a lot more epic in scope compared to Percy Jackson, and because of the multiple POVs, you know, following different characters, even characters who you may not like as much, but POV switches, different storylines happening concurrently, this kind of thing is something that is a fixture of the fantasy genre. So for this series to actually kind of, you know, start doing a little bit of that stuff in a YA / middle grade sort of sphere is actually really great. I commend Riordan for actually making that decision with the series, and I think it's the best decision he made, because it's his most mature prose as a result, because he's actually having to focus on different characters and being in their heads, as opposed to writing from one singular POV and having one sense of humor that kind of sticks through the whole thing. You kind of get different perspectives on stuff, as POVs tend to be, and it really works for this series, whereas I think he has grossly underutilized the third-person limited multi-POV type of storytelling thing that he did here. It's a lot of why this series is my favorite of his personally. If you want to experience a story that is still kind of YA-ish, but that doesn't have any garbage tropes in it, that doesn't have any garbage sex stuff in it, that treats its readers like they are mature, save for some jokes that kind of don't really hit the mark. That's kind of like Riordan in general occasionally, though, so like it's kind of a sticking point anyway. That gives younger readers a taste of, like I said, what epic fantasy structure and storytelling is like. This is that. This is more or less the perfect YA series in my mind, because aside from a couple one-liner jokes that are just kind of stupid, and certain aspects of certain POVs, prose, and narration being kind of stuck 10 years ago in some of the references, like the pop culture references that Riordan likes to do, they don't always land. Some of them have aged out already, you know, that kind of thing. Aside from those very minor sticking points, like this is basically the perfect YA series for somebody who doesn't want the garbage YA stuff that is written by adult women who just want teens having sex for some creepy reason. Overall, the series is comprised of a lot of great stuff, in my opinion. There's solid pacing and structure that wraps everything all together. There's regularity in POV allocation, which really aids in keeping the story going, compared to some other fantasy series that seems to forget about some of their plot lines. This is something that, like, you could accuse Robert Jordan of having a problem with. Certain POVs last for a really surprisingly long time before switching to another POV again. You have book 5 where one of the main characters just literally does not exist in the book for some reason that isn't properly explained. I mean, like, there are reasons you could explain it technically, but like the character just isn't in the book for some reason. These books don't have that problem because they're actually very regular. In the first book, you switch between the 3 POVs every 2 chapters. After that, it's always every 4 chapters. Over the next 4 books, every 4 chapters, the POVs switch. There's some amount of regularity and structure in how these POVs switch as well. There's some, regularity to things that really helps. Like I said, none of these POVs, none of these plot lines are ever forgotten. There's regularity in how things appear, and there's intention with which POVs are chosen, and the way that scenes are incorporated, and different myths and legends and stuff are incorporated therein. There's some pretty decent foreshadowing without giving up on the fun Riordan twists and turns throughout the series. You're still getting the fun romp that goes from scene to scene, but there's a lot of foreshadowing for the whole series that has you actually wondering how things are going to turn out. There's a lot of contemplation about that in the series. That's pretty good. The series continues exploring some of the Greek mythology stuff that makes Percy Jackson so good, but it also incorporates a little bit of the Roman mythology stuff that Percy Jackson missed. And that's one of the great aspects of the series, as well as that kind of dynamic. In fact, the first 2 books are more or less the same book, just from different sides of the story in that regard. You'll know what I mean if you've read the books or if you choose to read the books. And then the rest of the books are those kind of combining and having to come to a truce and a standstill and a alliance of one form or another. That's one of the major driving factors of the story that is really great. There's even more epic and even more consistency here than Percy Jackson has. It also sets up Trials of Apollo surprisingly well, which is a series that I thought didn't need to exist at first, but reading the last book recently, I was like, oh yeah, that series is actually super well telegraphed. Like, Riordan didn't just pull that out of his hat. He planned to make another series about Apollo after Heroes of Olympus. I just didn't really notice it at the time, so that was something that was pretty fun. There was also some references in the final book that kind of sets up the Percy Jackson sequel series, like the actual Percy Jackson and the Olympians books 6, 7, and 8. I believe it's supposed to be a trilogy or something like that. Those books are set up technically in this book, or at least I could see a way in which he could build off of that to make those books, which is interesting. So I appreciated being able to catch that as well. The ending and the climax of the whole series is great in my opinion. This is also something that is great with each book. None of the books feel like just part of the story. They do feel like part of the story, but they also have their own story arcs to get through, and that makes it really easy for younger people to read. Part of the audience kind of thing. Something that epic fantasy can sometimes struggle with is certain plot lines or POVs not really seeing proper resolution, certain books just kind of being part of the story rather than being their own thing within the plot of the story. And like, they don't have to be independent. That's not something that I'm arguing, but this book or this series manages to have books that are independent on their own. They can be read one at a time and be like, yeah, that was a complete story, but it's still part of the series. And that's something that I think is underappreciated in the fantasy genre, so at least that still exists here, means that younger readers can still get into it and be perfectly fine. And on that note, I should also specify this series also isn't episodic the way that Percy Jackson is. Percy Jackson kind of follows along that sort of like school kid kind of episodic trajectory in which each book takes place more or less a year after the last one. You're kind of continuing on the story, but like each plot is actually like very particular. They're still building on each other in a series format, but like each book is its own thing and it's an episode of this character's story leading up to the big moment. This is like one continuous storyline beginning to end. Like there's no episodes, there's no breaks here. So that's something that I should specify. As for the bad, there are some things that I will personally complain about a little bit, even though I really like this series. One thing that I think Riordan doesn't do the best at sometimes is his use of Deus Ex Machina. Certain solutions within the problem solving of these books feels a little bit too easy. That is a problem with all of his books. It's a problem with Percy Jackson. It's a problem with this. It's a problem with the Kane Chronicles. Sometimes he just wants to have cool scenes, cool things that happen to make the books entertaining and fun and good. Even if the solution to those problems is sometimes like, yeah, but these teenagers just got out of this situation a little bit easier than like they really have any right to be able to get out of that situation. But like, is it really that big of a problem? I don't necessarily think it is. It's kind of just what you're getting when you're reading this kind of YA. It's good YA, so the fact that Riordan does this to make the books, the series, entertaining is appreciated, even if you could definitely poke some holes in certain things and be like, yeah, there's no way this would have happened though. Like, it doesn't really matter. It's mostly for the entertainment, so that's what I enjoy it for. Plenty of the quips and references, as I kind of hinted at a little bit earlier in the book. Some of the quips, the jokes, the references, the narrations, making references that already feel outdated just a decade later. Some of these things just don't really land. Some of the jokes don't really land in the first place. Humor is subjective. I think certain characters' humor within the series will kind of bother some readers, especially people who just cannot stand a sort of YA sort of humor complex. Some of the lines are actually pretty good, but, you know, it kind of just is what it is for the most part. I don't think it's terrible, but it's not necessarily the best thing either, so just be aware of that. If you're reading a YA series, you might get some humor geared at a younger audience. That is something that you should be expecting if you're going into this series. Also, something that I also hinted at the beginning, or rather a little bit earlier in this review, these first two books, The Lost Hero and then The Son of Neptune, are basically the same book with different characters in certain regards, and that's, I don't know necessarily how intentional, quote unquote, that was, but there's definitely a purpose to it, so I don't think it's really that bad of a thing. But it is a thing to look out for. As for in terms of the ugly, some of the POV choices are surprising. This isn't necessarily that ugly, but I had to have something to be able to include in the section. The main thing is, this is like very minor spoiler stuff in this section, not crazy spoilers, just very minor stuff. The first book doesn't even have Percy Jackson. As the sequel series to Percy Jackson and the Olympians, the fact that the first book does not contain Percy, contains references to him, it does not actually contain him as a character, is a very bold decision on Riordan's part, and I think that's part of why certain characters in this book people don't really have a fond memory of. If you go onto the Reddit, especially the Camp Half-Blood Reddit, there's a lot of ire for Heroes of Olympus for some reason that I just personally don't get at all. But certain realms of the online audience for Rick Riordan just don't like some of the characters in the first book, and I suspect that saltiness because Percy wasn't in the book might be a little bit of it. One of my personal qualms with the series is that the Percy and Annabeth POVs in the House of Hades should have been longer each time, namely that all of the other POVs are like 40-50 pages long. Their POVs, Percy's and Annabeth's, are only like 20 pages long, even like 15, so it just kind of feels a little off-putting to switch back and forth and have one of them be done in like 20 minutes and the other last like an hour. It's kind of an odd kind of dichotomy there, personally, for me. The Blood of Olympus, as the last book, includes 2 new POVs to the whole series that don't have POVs in the rest of the series, and doesn't have either Annabeth or Percy, so some of the POV choices throughout the series are a little bit strange, but I don't think they're bad. I think Riordan chooses these intentionally and does so well. Some people take issue with some of the POVs in general, like I was just hinting that in the first book. You get introduced to a new cast of characters in Jason, Leo, and Piper. People just don't really like Jason and Piper for some reason. Like, neither of these seem to be very popular characters, and I cannot for the life of me fathom why. I can't really tell what the reception of the new characters in The Son of Neptune are, namely Hazel and Frank, but Leo, the other character from the first book, seems to be an okay reception. People seem to like Leo. Generally, it's the typical kind of complaints you'll find with fantasy in terms of, you know, getting a taste of certain characters up to and including an occasional POV you might not necessarily like as much. It's okay. Like, I think some people get too hung up on that with this series because they haven't experienced series with serious POV allocation issues. I think it's perfectly fine in this series, but it is something that some people complain about. It's good practice, in my opinion. For the ranking of the series, I'll quickly go through the series from my least favorite to my favorite, and, you know, kind of explain a little bit why, still without spoilers. My least favorite, which is a big surprise, is actually The Mark of Athena, ranking in 5th place. I don't know, it's just kind of the weakest book in my mind, and it might be the fact that I was thinking of this book and The House of Hades for a long time in my mind as the best of the series, and I read this one, and I'm like, yeah, but, like, that wasn't actually the best of the series, though. It's good, but, like, it's kind of the weakest as far as the series is concerned. It's a little bit formulaic in some ways. The next 2 books are both tied for that, you know, 3rd, 4th place position, and it's largely for the reason because Lost Hero and Son of Neptune are pretty much the exact same book. They have great setup and formula execution, but like the Son of Neptune is ranking below the Son of Neptune. This is in 4th place because, well, it's basically the exact same book as the Lost Hero. Lost Hero is ranking in 3rd place because even though it is great, it doesn't quite reach the heights of the other 2 books. In 2nd place for me is The House of Hades, which is a flawed but very strong story. It has a lot of great stuff in it. My main issue is that the Percy and Annabeth sections feel too short, so you feel like, even though this is the longest book in the series, you feel like you're missing part of the story because there's just so little happening with Percy and Annabeth in their POVs. Like, there's still plenty of stuff happening, like, as in terms of the actual events of the story, but they're short, so you just plow right through them, and it doesn't feel great. When you have, POVs that last like 30, 40, 50, even 60 pages throughout basically the rest of the series, only discounting The Lost Hero because those POVs only last 2 chapters apiece rather than 4. When the rest of the series is comprised of 40, 50, 60 page POV lengths, the House of Hades having, an entire plot line where all of their POVs last for like 20 pages is kind of disappointing, but that's a personal issue that I have with it. The Blood of Olympus, however, is my favorite book, which is even more surprising than the Mark of Athena being at the very bottom, because there was a time, like I said, when House of Hades and Mark of Athena were my favorites in the series, and I was like, okay, I like these, but like the Blood of Olympus, I feel like I remember that being my favorite or one of my favorites in the series, but I just don't remember. So I just never really considered it a favorite because I wasn't sure. I was so unsure. I wasn't willing to commit to saying that was one of my favorites. On the reread, I was expecting it to be a little bit lower down because I think if you had like the Camp Half-Blood Reddit server rank Heroes of Olympus, I'm pretty sure Blood of Olympus would very handily be at the bottom of the series. And like, no, actually, it's great as a climax for the series. I think it fully satisfies on what it does. I'm a sucker for endings and climaxes, so I love it. Maybe it's just the fact that it's back to having Leo, Jason, and Piper as POVs and not having Percy and Annabeth as POVs, but like, it's great. It's a great book. I really enjoyed it. So that is basically my ranking. And for the recommendation, if you couldn't tell watching, 20 minutes or more of me rambling about the series, I recommend The Heroes of Olympus. If you've read and liked Percy Jackson, 100% read this series. Like, there's no reason why you should not read this series to me. It is, in my opinion, a better series. It's larger in scope, follows more characters and stuff, it has disparate plot lines and separate POVs. It is really underutilized by Riordan in general, that I think is executed very well for the purpose of this series. It follows a series of one long story, even with technically smaller parts. That's how series exist, but it follows one long story that is so much more satisfying to follow along with than the episodic nature, say, of Percy Jackson and the Olympians. I'm not personally someone who loves episodic stories, so this works a little bit better for me, but like, if you want someone to get into something that's a little bit more mature, but they enjoyed Percy Jackson, this is the way to go easily. Like, I will personally always be a proponent of Percy Jackson and the Olympians and Heroes of Olympus for middle grade and YA readers as a means to get into reading. It's something that sparked a reading obsession in me. Riordan is one of the main reasons I wanted to become a writer as early as 4th and 5th grade. Like, I think they're perfectly suitable for adults as well, even though they are YA and have a couple things that some adults might find sticking points as far as YA goes, but like, these are some of the most perfect YA books I can think of personally on the market. For quick and easy reading and fun, the series is super solid, so I recommend them. And with that, I've now reread and reviewed the 3 Riordan series I have completely read and finished before in my life, those being Percy Jackson, Heroes of Olympus, and the Kane Chronicles. So, in the meantime, for a little while, I know these Riordan reviews are pretty long and, few and far between, and a little bit longer because I cover the full series instead of the individual books. I just don't feel like these books justify having individual reviews for them, generally speaking. There's not enough going on with them to justify doing that. They would all be like 5-minute videos, so I don't necessarily need to do that. In the meantime now, in the future, before I actually move on to reading more series, I'll be doing some short stories and other auxiliary material that Riordan has done with this world. Those being stuff like the Demigod Files and the Demigod Diaries, which those two are associated, one with Percy Jackson and one with the Heroes of Olympus. I forget which is technically which, but I need to read those. I also plan to read the 3 short stories, Demigods and Magicians, which basically combine Percy Jackson and Kane Chronicle worlds together. So that's something that I've not read before, that I actually really, really want to read. I'm excited to experience that for the first time. But the next full series from Riordan for me is going to be Magnus Chase, which is a partial reread. 2 of those books are rereads. I know that I've read the first 2 of them. I have plenty of scenes still stuck in my head from those first couple of books, plenty of good scenes, plenty of scenes that I'm not necessarily as hyped about, kind of depends on the situation. But I maybe read like 50 pages of the 3rd book, and like that's it. That was when I was in a period of reading basically nothing and DNFing everything because I just didn't finish books. Not because I didn't like them, but because I just didn't finish books. That was something that I had a problem with for many years. Magnus Chase was one of the series that I did this to, but yeah, Magnus Chase trilogy will be the next one that I read. The first 2 will be rereads. The 3rd one will be basically completely new for all intents and purposes. But finishing that will be new, like I said, so that's something that I'm looking forward to doing. Not this year in 2024. I'll probably read that trilogy in 2025, and then hopefully relatively shortly thereafter that, I'll start reading Trials of Apollo, which is a brand new adventure for me, all but the first like 30 or 40 pages of the first book, so that will be exciting. And then the Percy Jackson Senior Year Adventure series is brand new stuff that I've not even bought yet, surprisingly enough. So that's basically it for this video. I've continued on with my Rick Riordan journey. I've enjoyed myself. I plan to continue enjoying myself. At least I hope that I continue enjoying myself. But yeah, like I said, I'm going to do some auxiliary stuff in between before I move on to the next series. But that is the end of this video. Thank you for watching. If you did, this video was an absolute mess, and I'm sorry about it. But I'll see you in the next video if you happen to stick through it and happen to be a crazy person and are in the running for watching more for some reason. That sentence didn't even make sense. I'm going to go before I embarrass myself anymore.